And breaking tonight, more trouble on the streets of Britain, this time in the heart of Westminster, as protesters clashed with riot police outside Downing Street. Crowds have been heard chanting "Save our kids" and "Stop the boats" in central London, and we've also seen protesters attempt to kick down fences. The Met Police have placed strict conditions on the "enough is enough."
23 stores were breached, 112 arrests were recorded, 4 city districts were declared unsafe, public transport was blockaded. Entire shopping streets were left effectively emptied in under 1 hour. According to early consolidated reports, these events were recorded almost simultaneously, not in one location, but across multiple urban zones. This was not random, it was inevitable. Cities emptied before explanations arrived. Police lines retreated before answers were given. Information vanished. At the moment it mattered most, this was no longer about the streets. It became about who controls the narrative and who pays the price. Today did not begin with a crime, it began with pressure, rising living costs, expanding digital enforcement, and a growing sense that control was tightening. It arrived as surveillance at the exact moment households were already stretched to breaking point. No spark is required. The system itself becomes the trigger. By late morning, the city had begun to slide. Not at night, not after curfew, but in full daylight. At 11:18 a.m, the first retail block shut down. No damage was reported. No public warning was issued, only instructions to leave. At 11:27, public transport slowed across multiple routes. Not because of technical faults, but because officers were pulled from routine patrols and reassigned to containment points. At 11:41, everyday city life began to fracture. Non-essential services paused. Offices sent staff home early.
This is a police message. Please stay indoors. Remember, you can only go out to go to work and come home, to go to the shop, to collect medication, and for one exercise a day.
Residents were advised to avoid central areas. This happened not after violence, but before it. At 11:56 a.m, the first confrontation erupted in broad daylight. Police lines advanced, then stalled. Command shifted, not on the ground, but procedurally. Dispersal was abandoned. Containment was imposed. By 12:09, remaining shopping corridors were cleared. Not by force, but by fear. And by 12:22, reports confirmed what authorities had not yet said aloud. This was no longer local. Control had fractured across the city, not because warnings were missed, but because discretion had been designed out of the system. Beyond the high streets, disruption moved into daily life. In Birmingham, schools issued early dismissal notices, parents adjusted routes, after-school activities were quietly cancelled. Elderly residents were advised to remain indoors as a precaution. Commuters avoided central routes. This was not chaos, it was social recalibration. When uncertainty spreads beyond one city, normal life begins to contract. By the time official statements reached the public, communities had already adjusted their behaviour. The system did not order withdrawal. The signals were enough. As pressure widened, the response shifted upward. In London, additional barriers were raised around government buildings, including areas near Number 10. Public order units were redeployed nationwide. Coverage became uneven. Brief clashes were reported at several pressure points as police lines were pushed back and reformed. There was no sustained disorder, but enough contact to signal strain. By mid-afternoon, incidents were being reported across multiple environments, including transport hubs, residential streets, and open public spaces. Officials later described the situation as contained. Residents experienced it differently. Containment does not end disruption. It displaces it. What became visible on the streets was not an absence of manpower. It was a breakdown in operational authority. Frontline officers were deployed within tightly bounded rule sets. Local commanders operated under approval chains that prioritised escalation over discretion. Decisions travelled upward for validation, while conditions on the ground evolved in real time. The response model favoured containment. Perimeters were established, movement was managed, but pressure points were left unresolved. This approach treats unrest as something to be held rather than addressed. It stabilises appearances while allowing tension to accumulate inside defined spaces. When authority is centralised to this degree, initiative at street level erodes, not because officers lack judgment, but because judgment is no longer theirs to exercise. Delay follows, uncertainty grows, and uncertainty invites misinterpretation. This is not a failure of individuals, it is the predictable outcome of a command structure that removes autonomy from those closest to events. Public order cannot be maintained through procedural caution alone. It depends on empowered response at the point of contact. As events accelerated, official communication lagged behind reality. Public briefings were calibrated to reassure rather than illuminate. Updates arrived incrementally, often after behaviours on the ground had already shifted. This created a widening gap between lived experience and institutional narrative. When people experience disruption directly, they do not wait for confirmation, they respond to signals. In the absence of timely clarity, interpretation fills the void. Speculation is not born from excess information, but from delayed information. Modern governance often assumes restraint reduces volatility. In practice, the opposite occurs. When detail is withheld to prevent concern, concern intensifies. When explanation is delayed, trust decays. Transparency is not defined by volume or tone, it is defined by timing. A public that feels informed retains patience, a public that feels managed loses it. Confidence does not collapse. Because events are complex, it collapses when institutions appear out of sync with reality. The conditions that produced this moment were not sudden. Pressure had been accumulating across multiple domains. Economic strain reduced margin. Compliance requirements increased visibility. Administrative systems expanded reach without expanding reassurance. Individually, each policy functioned as intended. Collectively, they compressed tolerance. When adaptation is demanded simultaneously across work, movement, and compliance, societies lose flexibility. Governance increasingly prioritised prevention over participation. Risk management replaced representation. Efficiency displaced empathy. This does not require malicious intent to produce instability. It only requires layering. Systems designed without allowance for human bandwidth inevitably overload. The lesson is structural. Policy success cannot be measured in isolation. A framework that performs well on paper can fracture when applied to lives already under strain. Resilience requires margin. Without it, even small disruptions become catalytic. What unfolded exposed more than a local breakdown. It revealed a national response trajectory. When disruption emerges, the same mechanisms activate: containment, communication restraints, and delayed adaptation. If left structurally intact, this response model becomes the default rather than the exception. The danger is not repetition, it is normalization. When societies adapt to disruption as routine, expectations quietly lower, mobility contracts, public space thins, engagement becomes conditional. National stability is not measured by how quickly silence returns, but by how effectively confidence is restored. If institutions respond to stress by narrowing participation, distance replaces dialogue, and once distance becomes standard, reconnection is difficult. The central lesson is not about arrest, it is about governance under pressure. When systems prioritise control over trust, they do not create stability, they create distance. And distance, once normalised, quietly reshapes behaviour. Citizens stop engaging, communities stop waiting, and institutions stop listening. Security without transparency erodes legitimacy. Efficiency without participation weakens resilience. Order maintained through silence lasts only as long as silence holds. A stable society is not one that suppresses tension quickly, but one that absorbs tension visibly, explains decisions clearly, and allows correction before pressure becomes rupture. Governance is not tested when conditions are calm. It is tested when systems are strained and choices become uncomfortable. The question facing institutions is not how to restore order overnight, but how to rebuild confidence over time. Because order imposed can quiet streets temporarily, but order understood, debated and trusted is what sustains a nation when pressure returns.